Welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's topic because we're going to look at one of the most famous events in all of human history through an entirely new lens. You know, when we think of American independence, we almost always picture a sudden flashpoint, right? Like this spontaneous spark of rebellion. But honestly, the truth is that it was actually the inevitable explosion of a historical pressure cooker. The tension we're going to talk about had literally been building up for over a century.
So that brings us right to our big, central question. How in the world did a group of starving, totally isolated settlements actually manage to unite and overthrow the single most powerful empire on Earth? Well, let's dive right in and trace this escalating friction step by step. We'll start from the incredibly harsh realities of early survival and take it all the way to an explosive, world-changing revolution.
Section 1. The Crucible of Survival. Let's look at that early colonial stress.
When the English first started setting up on the East Coast, they were looking for profit. What they actually found, though, was starvation and relentless conflict. I mean, from Jamestown nearly collapsing entirely into anarchy in 1607 to the staggering mortality rate of the Pilgrims in 1620, basic survival was just not guaranteed. Add in violent, terrifying clashes like the Powhatan attack and the Pequot War, and you've got a society whose very baseline was forged in intense, unending stress.
So, who exactly were the people living inside this pressure cooker? Well, the early arrivals were a desperate, highly combustible mix. You had private groups hunting for profit, Puritans fleeing religious persecution, and peasants totally displaced by European industrialization. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that between the 1610s and the Revolution, Britain shipped an estimated 50,000 to 120,000 convicts straight to these colonies. Think about that. This was definitely not a comfortable, unified society. And that overarching sense of desperation, it was deeply fueled by severe labor shortage. Over half of all European immigrants arrived as indentured servants, literally trading years of unfree labor just for a ticket across the Atlantic. The southern colonies took this even further, building an entire agricultural system squarely on the backs of millions of people enslaved and imported from Africa. So the very foundations of this colonial society were heavily rooted in harsh, unfree labor.
Section 2. Developing an American identity. Forging a new spirit.
A really major factor in shaping this new identity was something called salutary neglect. Basically, this was the British policy of avoiding strict enforcement of parliamentary laws in the colonies. Because Britain took this totally hands-off approach for decades, a fiercely independent American spirit took deep root. The colonists simply got used to running their own affairs without London constantly breathing down their necks.
It created this crazy double standard. On paper, you had official British rule, right? Governors appointed directly from London. But the colonial reality was completely different. Growing populations were relying on locally elected legislatures to vote on taxes and pass everyday laws. These colonies were rapidly getting richer than parts of Britain itself. This massive disconnect between distant formal authority and everyday local self-governance, that slowly but surely turned up the heat.
At exactly the same time, this independent spirit started leaping from politics right into personal faith. In the 1740s, we hit the First Great Awakening. Led by evangelical preachers like Jonathan Edwards, this was a massive, sweeping religious revival. It promoted an intense, highly personal conviction and a direct love for God. Early evangelists, like Methodists and Baptists, even began preaching for religious freedom and pushing for the abolition of slavery in the South. This awakening stirred up a deep sense of personal independence that pushed the colonist mindset even further away from traditional European norms.
Section 3. The Imperial Squeeze. Britain tightens its grip. Okay, so the dynamic shifts drastically after 1754. During the French and Indian War, the colonists actually needed British military support. But by 1763, with the French threat entirely removed, Britain didn't exactly celebrate with the colonies. Instead, they issued the Royal Proclamation to completely halt westward expansion, and they started strictly enforcing mercantilism to pull revenue. After decades of being ignored, this sudden, incredibly tight squeeze felt like a massive betrayal.
The colonial response was surprisingly swift. Benjamin Franklin published his incredibly famous call to action, "Join or Die." And this brilliantly illustrates his realization that facing this sudden external pressure from their own king, if these disparate, isolated settlements didn't band together immediately, they simply wouldn't survive the empire's new, suffocating grip.
Section 4. The Boiling Point. Reaching the Limit.
From here, the escalation is dizzyingly rapid.
In 1765, the Stamp Act passes. Boom, immediate strain. By 1770, a mob clash with British troops leaves 5 people dead in the Boston Massacre. In 1773, colonists take massive direct action with the Boston Tea Party. And the very next year, Parliament drops the hammer with the Intolerable Acts. The sheer pace of these compounding events perfectly mirrors Britain's total loss of control.
The core of all this anger during the boiling point is summed up in a rallying cry I'm sure you know: no taxation without representation. When the Stamp Act hit, the colonists flat out refused to pay. Why? Because Parliament entirely bypassed the colonial legislatures. To the colonists, only their own locally elected representatives had the true authority to tax them. Bypassing those local bodies set the stage for a massive, direct clash with Parliament itself.
But the absolute final strain on our historical pressure cooker was the Intolerable Acts of 1774. By stripping Massachusetts of its historic right to self-government and literally imposing military rule, Britain sparked absolute outrage everywhere. Patriot leaders looked at this and realized, hey, if they can do this to Massachusetts, they can do it to any of us. This unified fear pushed the colonies to finally coordinate their resistance, convening the First Continental Congress to boycott British trade and formally petition the king. Section 5. Explosion and Revolution, Igniting the War.
Well, those petitions, they fell on entirely deaf ears. The ideological conflict finally turned violently kinetic on April 19, 1775. The battles of Lexington and Concord were the literal sparks that ignited armed conflict. Almost overnight, the Second Continental Congress established the Continental Army, and they unanimously selected George Washington as its commander-in-chief. The American Revolutionary War had officially begun.
But you have to understand, the explosion wasn't just military, it was profoundly ideological. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence enshrined Thomas Jefferson's core thesis: the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, along with the incredibly revolutionary idea that governments only derive power from the consent of the governed. This document right here was the intellectual explosion that fully and finally rejected European monarchism in favor of a new republicanism.
Now, actually translating those grand ideas into reality, that required a brutal, grueling path for the Continental Army. Washington's incredibly covert crossing of the Delaware in 1776 barely kept the cause alive. Then, the crucial victory at Saratoga secured vital European support, which eventually allowed American forces to completely trap a British army at Yorktown in 1781. Finally, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally acknowledged the United States. That century-long pressure was finally released.
Which leaves us with this final thought for today. We've seen how an identity forged by intense friction, immense hardship, and a defiant, rebellious spirit ultimately broke an empire. So, I have to ask you, how does the friction of the 17th and 18th centuries continue to shape the American identity today? How much of that original pressure cooker mentality still influences our modern culture, our politics, and the very way we view independence right now? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.